Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, and today I am reviewing this LK Chen Striking Eagle Jian. Now, a little bit of background here. This is not my sword. LK Chen's representative KK contacted me and asked if I wanted to do a review of it, and when I replied in the affirmative, he sent it on to me. Now, I don't get to keep this sword. It is a loaner. I believe it's going to be making its way to some other YouTubers and sword reviewers for them to do reviews on it as well. LK Chen sells the Striking Eagle for $425 on their website and then an additional $100 to ship it to the US. You can also sometimes find the Striking Eagle on Cult of Athena, where it sells for a little bit more than the $425, but then their tax and shipping ends up, at least to me, bringing the price to about $515. So overall, I'm going to consider this sword to be about $500 for this review. And I should mention that this is not the standard Striking Eagle. Their normal one, if you will, is has an alternating white and black cord wrap on it without any risers. And you can get this all black one by going to their website and on the cord wrap section selecting black with risers. This sword is not modeled after any specific historical artifact, rather it is LK Chen's interpretation of a Chu Dynasty Jian. Most of the historical artifacts from this time period are from tomb finds from the 1950s to 1980s, and these tombs dated to around 315 to 221 BCE. This particular sword, the extremely notable length, is inspired by the longest Jian ever recovered from China, which was found in 1983 in the tomb of Jiaomo. I apologize for my Chinese pronunciation, I'm sure it's brutal. And that tomb dated to 122 BCE. This Han Dynasty mural shows a warrior carrying a sword that looks fairly similar to this one. Now, perhaps they were still in use during the Han Dynasty. Perhaps this mural is simply depicting somebody from a previous age. When you're looking at history from 2,000 years plus ago, a lot of context gets lost. I think it's pretty cool in a sword nerd type of way to take a look at this sword and contrast it to the most famous European sword of the time, the gladius used in the Roman Republic. Take a look at those differences. Now, in terms of how this sword would have been used historically, as far as I'm aware, there are no martial arts manuals that have been found. I believe there have been references to manuals found, but none of the actual manuals. So the actual martial arts are kind of a lost art, but apparently the martial arts was quite robust with schools for civilians and a very booming weapons trade. I know LK Chen is trying to recreate some of those martial arts, and there's a video they have linked where they showcase 3 different ways to grip this sword. I will put a link in the description to that video, as they are far better at doing it than I am. Now, when I see this sword, when I pick it up, when I move it around, it immediately to me screams thrusting sword. Especially with the long length, the long grip, it honestly feels kind of like a blend between a spear and a sword. It's not to say it can't cut, it certainly can, but to me, it feels and looks and just screams to me thrust focused. The sword comes with a wood core scabbard, which is 2 pieces of wood that are glued together. It's got the Chinese equivalent of a brass chape, a little brass like hook here for suspension, which is attached via glue, and then this cord wrap also helps secure it. The lacquer on it is quite nice, very even, not really any ripples at all. And when I look at the mouth of the scabbard, I can't actually even make out the lines where the 2 slabs of wood were glued together. So they put a good deal of effort into making this look really nice. Now, wearing this, I think, would be tricky. That mural I mentioned before does show a warrior wearing one, but to me it looks like it's attached to the belt a little further down than this one would be, and even then the hilt sticks up to around shoulder length. That's going to make this awkward to carry. I don't think I could personally wear this myself, but I'm not going to do that either, because when am I going to walk around carrying a 4-foot long blade? What do I need that for? Now, one bad thing about this scabbard is that down here towards the, I'm going to just call it a shape because that's what I know it as. It's not either not evenly shaped completely or it's very slightly warped because it does kink off a little bit. I don't know if that's warping or if it's just uneven shaping. And I don't know if it's causing it, but the fit here is less than ideal. If I put the sword in, it can go in all the way until about an inch left of the blade, and then it starts binding very tightly. If I put it in any further than that, it's going to get stuck and require a lot of force to get out. And so I never put it into the scabbard that much because I don't want to get stuck, especially because this isn't my sword. So I don't know if that this different shape or warping down here might be causing it. I don't know if the climate where I live has affected the fit. When I first got it, it was very snug, but since then it seems to have contracted just a little bit, and it's just not really a functional scabbard where I live. Let's talk about the very simple hilt next, starting with the most complex part, the grip. So this is a wood core grip with a layer of Samegawa or rayskin, and then this cord wrap on it. It's got these 6 different risers here. I'm not sure if there's a material underneath the risers that are causing the extra shape or if it's just extra cord wrap doing that. My hunch would be the former because this cord wrap is actually extremely tight everywhere. There's pretty much no wiggle to it at all. And I think if it was just a double cord wrap, there would probably be a little bit more wiggle. Just a hunch, and regardless, it doesn't really matter how they're formed because they work very well. Like I said, there's absolutely no wiggle to them at all. I think if we took off the cord texture, you would see that there are probably at least 1 pin, I would guess a couple more, holding it all together because it is not peened at all. This is a butt cap, not a pommel. And the shape of the grip is really nicely done. It's elliptical, but it's getting close to having a central ridge here. It doesn't have a full ridge. It's not sharp or anything like that. It's just really refined is the way to put it. It's wider than it is thick, and it works for edge alignment so very well. I have no problem indexing that blade's edge every time I use it. There's absolutely no hot spots anywhere on this grip. And with how long it is, you can put your hands in a lot of different positions on here. No problems on any of them. You can slide your hands up and down at kind of like a pole arm, and it's all very comfortable. It's a very, very well done grip. And like I mentioned, this butt cap is a butt cap, not a pommel, kind of like a kashira on a katana. I'm pretty sure it is glued in place. It's very simple brass. It's probably cast. And while there are some very slight ledges at the transition to the cord wrap, I've never had any issues. For one, you don't have to grip it there. For two, even if I do grip it there, it's never bit my hand at all. The guard is also brass and I believe cast and very small. The transition here between the guard and the cord wrap is a little bit better. There's potential. I could see somebody getting their finger caught just a little bit, but I've never done it, so it doesn't seem to me to be a problem. Now that said, this guard provides almost no hand protection. I think if a sword slid down the blade and bumped into the guard, it's possible for that sword to actually slide off, but I think it could actually slide into the hand a little bit. So there's very minimal protection here. It's certainly possible with this long of a sword that your hands aren't going to be in as vulnerable of a position as you would normally expect because you're so far away from the target. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. Unfortunately, I do not have any measurements for you. My calipers decided to give up the ghost right in the middle of doing measurements, and I have not received their replacement yet. So for this review, we're going to have to forego those. So this very long blade, it's around 42 inches, has a quite narrow profile and not a lot of profile taper. It is there, it does very gently narrow, and it's very even tapering as well, right up until it gets to the ogive curve of the tip. Now the thickness, again, I can't measure it, but it is pretty thick at the guard and has very even distal taper and a lot of distal taper. It gets quite thin out here. I don't have the exact numbers, sorry, The calipers died. Hopefully I get new ones soon. And the blade is octagonal in cross-section, which is not something you find very often on European swords. I think it's a little bit more common on Jian, but what that does is it aids in the rigidity some though, because it adds just a little bit more meat in the center of the blade, and that's a good thing when you have this long of a blade, because you need it to stay rigid longer than you would on a blade that was a foot shorter. However, there are, of course, trade-offs to that. And one of the primary ones is going to be cutting ability, because the primary bevel has such a shorter distance to travel rather than from the central ridge all the way out to the edge. Just from this transition here, it's going to be a steeper primary bevel and therefore steeper angle for cuts, and just not be quite as good at cutting. When looking down the lengths of the blade, you can see some rippling on it, and if I run my fingers along the surface, I can feel the rippling a little bit as well. It doesn't appear to be too much though. And what I mean by too much rippling is if the ripples are too deep, they can actually affect the thickness of the sword too much and create weak spots. Like if you're running imagine this is the blade, and you have a dip here and then it gets thicker again. That place where it dips, it's going to be less strong of a blade there. It's going to be encourage the sword to flex there, and if that's in the wrong spot, you don't want the sword to flex there, and it could also weaken the steel, making it easier to take a set there. So all that being said, that doesn't seem to be the case on this sword. It has rippling, but it doesn't seem to me to be deep rippling. It's pretty shallow. The central ridge does have a tiny bit of waviness to it, but not very much, and honestly, overall, it's very crisp and better than you normally find at this price point. The blade is made of pattern welded steel. The two types are 1060 and T8 tool steel. Here is LK Chen's listing that shows what the chemical compositions of those steels are. The blade has been etched to bring out the pattern, probably with some kind of acid solution, but it's not overly etched. It's a pretty subtle look that looks really good, I think. The tip is very well formed, curving into a very nice and acute point. There's some very tiny asymmetries here, but they are frankly not big enough to even point out. The edge beveling, as I've come to expect from LK Chen, is outstanding. It's one smooth bevel where the primary bevel starts all the way to the edge with no secondary bevel, no micro bevel, nothing like that. And the ridge where that primary bevel starts, it's not the central ridge, but that ridge is incredibly crisp and very straight down the entire length of the blade. It's actually really impressive how crisply defined that is. And to test the edge, let's take a look at some paper cutting here. So this is around the sweet spot, and it's sliced through there very, very easily, actually. Slicing through that paper very, very easily. Let's put it in. Yeah, so I can, if I draw it through like that, it is incredibly easy to just slice right through the paper. Let's try drawing it through across a longer length of the sword. So it caught there once, but very gently, and it still cut through very nicely. Yeah, this is overall a very well sharpened sword. It's not crazy sharp, but it is very well sharpened. Let's take a look at some cutting footage. Now, I did not do tatami with the sword, and it has nothing to do with the sword. It has everything to do with the fact that I live in the desert, and it gets really hot here. I did 2 water bottle sessions with this sword, and I cut with that at around 7:30 in the morning, and it was already pushing 90 degrees Fahrenheit. During the day, it regularly gets up to 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and when you have to soak tatami for 12 hours, 24 hours, I don't want to let it sit out in that kind of heat. I'm not looking to boil the tatami here. So no tatami. It's probably going to be less common for the next few months on my channel, just because it is a challenge in temperatures like this. But water bottles, like I said, I did 2 cutting sessions with this, and this sword cuts water bottles very, very well. Now, you might notice in this cutting footage that I'm using a variety of grips. Stay tuned for the next section to talk about that a little bit more. Overall, this sword cuts water bottles very, very well. It's a lot of fun to move around and cut, and with the sharpness on offer here, it's not a surprise that it cuts through water bottles so easily. Even when I'm using grips that I'm not particularly familiar with, I was able to get good solid cuts most of the time. All right, let's talk about handling and do some comparisons to this sword. So this sword, despite being just extremely long, I don't think there's any way I'm going to be able to get this entire thing in frame, is surprisingly light. This is 2 pounds, 11.5 ounces, right around there. So not even 3 pounds. And it is beastly long. And it's a little bit weird to handle because I'm not used to a grip that is this long for any sword, really. And sometimes when I'm moving it around, it can actually get in the way a little bit because I am not particularly familiar with using it. Now, part of that is also the way to grip the sword. I am 100% not an expert in this, but I do think there's, historically speaking, from what I understand, there would be 3 types of grips used with this kind of sword. The first being clasped hands, which is basically both hands on top of each other. And this would be for very quick, short movements that are almost all wrist-based. And this is by far the type of grip I am least comfortable with this sword because I've never used this type of grip before. It's designed to be the fastest, the nimblest grip. But again, not something I'm very familiar with. The next would be close hands, where the hands are separated or not on top of each other, but they're still very close. And this is going to give you a lot of tip control, also a lot of control over the blade, but less than the previous. You're going to use still mostly your wrists in moving it around, but you can start getting the arms more involved. Although I don't think Chinese swordsmanship of this type of sword would use the big motions. It's, from what I understand, it's mostly very quick, very nimble motions rather than, big chopping cuts. And lastly, the type that I believe would be the least common way of using it would be to separate the hands out. This might be a little exaggerated. Maybe it's like this. I don't know. But I have tried doing it like this. And this, while it feels, you would think this would feel more natural to me because it tends to be how I grip a long sword, is keeping my hands separated a little bit. But when I do it like this, they're so separated, this stops feeling kind of starts feeling like a pole arm and less like a sword, because there's so much difference in where the hands grip that the leverage just changes a lot. And when I'm like this, I definitely feel like I should be doing push-pull movements. And it still has a lot of tip control. I can move it around very easily. And then part of that's because it's so light. It's so nimble. At 2 pounds, 12 ounces about, for such a long blade, it doesn't feel like it should be this light. It doesn't look like it should be this light. Just looking at it, yes, it's a very narrow profile, but it's not thin. It's got a lot of meat to it. And it just doesn't it's tricky. It doesn't act quite the way I'm expecting it to act, which is a good thing, because looking at it, I look at it and I'm like, that thing's going to be a monster to handle. And it really isn't. It really moves very well, no matter how I use it. Although, I gotta say, this clasped hands grip doesn't move that well for me because I am just not practiced with that grip at all. Now, with this long of a blade, you're going to get some wobble. If I'm just holding it out, you can probably see it wobbles just a little bit. It looks like to me it has a very small amount of sag when held out, but not very much. And that's a testament to the good design here, because it'd be very easy for a sword that is this long to thin out enough up here that it would start sagging like crazy, and you don't really want that. And it's definitely got a good amount of flexibility to it, if you can see that. Hopefully that's being caught on screen. It's got a good amount of flexibility, but not too much. You know, if I do this, I gotta be very careful because this is actually a very sharp sword. You can see it flexes, but not as much as I would expect for a sword of this length. It's girthy despite being narrow, and it has a good feel to it when it moves around. Yes, it flexes a little bit. Yes, it wobbles a little bit when it's out here, but not that much. And if you look, you can probably see, just because of how long it is, the center of percussion or the hilt node is right where you want it. It's right up near the top of the grip. So that's where the least amount of vibrations are when you're cutting and impacting things. So again, that's a testament to the good design here. And the point of balance, there's no way I'm going to be able to capture the entire sword on the screen here, but it's about there. It looks to me like about 6 inches out, which, like on a long sword, would definitely be on the further outside. That would definitely make the sword feel a little bit tip heavy. But because it's got a long grip, feels like there's a pretty good sized tang in here also. The weight doesn't feel tip heavy. You know, I can move it out here. Honestly, shockingly, with this long of a sword, it's usable one-handed. It doesn't feel great, but I gotta be careful. This is such a long sword that if I start doing much of any moving it around, I'm gonna hit something in this room, and I don't want to do that. But it is usable one-handed, which honestly, I think the biggest problem with using a one-handed is that the grip could end up hitting my body, which obviously would impede the use, but it is light enough and nimble enough that it is usable one-handed, especially if I'm just doing thrusts. This feels fine. So it's got a fairly far out point of balance, but it works. It's amazingly nimble for such a long sword. Now for comparisons, I don't have a lot of swords that really compare to this one, but what I do have here is my Lockwood SL1014, I believe the model is, and it's really hard to get these in shot. Hopefully that'll get it in. The guards are approximately equal there, so you can see that the LK Chen looked like about 6 inches longer. And if we compare the grips, so the Lockwood is probably about 4 to 5 inches shorter of a grippable area, maybe a bit longer than that. But this is probably my longest gripped longsword and one of the longer blades. And the profiles of the blades are actually not that different. So I want to see what they look like, or see what they feel like together. Let me put the LK Chen down for a moment. And the Lockwood, this was a complete happy coincidence, weighs pretty much the exact same amount as the Striking Eagle. It weighed 0.1 ounce heavier than the Striking Eagle. So that works perfectly. A good comparison. This feels nimbler. And that's mostly because this is a notably nimble sword. The point of balance is pretty close to the guard. That looks like about 2.5 to 3 inches. And there's pretty much no wobble to it. It doesn't have much presence out there. It doesn't feel like the tip is going to drag me anywhere. I can redirect motions very well. You know, it definitely, they actually feel very similar weight since they are, but yeah, moving them around, it feels quite a bit the same. This one does feel a little bit just more beefy overall than the Lockwood does. The Lockwood has more weight in the hilt with the cross guard, the big pommel. This has pretty much almost no cross guard. The pommel's just a brass cap on the end here. So it's got a little bit less meat back here. On the other hand, it is a longer grip, a longer tang, presumably. So that does help add weight. But the Lockwood definitely feels a little bit more nimble, a little bit more agile, but we're not talking big differences here. And another sword I'm going to compare to it is this Darksword Armory. I believe this is the Gothic longsword. I will make sure of that and put the actual name on screen here. But if you look here, The blade of the Darksword Armory is a little bit longer than the Lockwood, but it's still shorter than the LK Chen. And if we look at the grips, notably shorter on the Darksword Armory, like a good half a foot it looks like. So this is one of the reasons I chose this one, is because it's probably got the longest longsword blade I have. Now I'm going to put the LK Chen down for a moment. Another happy coincidence, maybe not, maybe I just chose good swords to compare this to. This Darksword Armory is half an ounce heavier than the Striking Eagle. So again, very similar weights. And I moved this out. By the way, I will have a review of this sword coming in several months, I believe is where it's on my schedule. And it is also noticeably nimble, very easy to move around. It does have some wobble. I don't know if you saw that there. It's not a lot, but it does have a little bit of wobble out there. Point of balance, looks like it's maybe about half an inch further out than the Lockwood. Not a big difference there. Certainly closer than the Striking Eagle. But yeah, this has, I would say, a little bit more blade presence than the Lockwood, a little bit less than the Striking Eagle, but it feels very similar also. Let me pick up the LK Chen here. Yeah, the LK Chen overall, despite the fact that it is actually a little bit lighter, it actually feels a little bit more bulky, and I think that's right in here where the blade is really noticeably quite thick. I feel weight there. I don't feel the weight out here. I feel it more right back here, and I think that's kind of, you know, Chinese swords, generally speaking, don't have big guards. European swords generally have large cross guards. They're gonna make up for that by having more, oftentimes more meat on the blade, maybe longer grips. They gotta counterbalance the sword somehow so it doesn't have a ton of weight out near the tip. So this sword does feel a little blade presence right back here, but not in a bad way. It still feels, like I've said, amazingly nimble, easy to move around. It's just combined with the fact that I am far more comfortable with European longswords, this just feels different, but good, if that makes sense. So I'm viewing this sword at about $500. What's the bottom line? Well, if you're familiar with my reviews, you might have noticed I skipped over potential improvements. And that's because I can really only think of one thing to say, and that's the scabbard fit. You know, I don't think it's really fair to blame LK Chen for the fact that this scabbard doesn't really fit anymore, because I have definitely noticed in this house and this climate, I've had more issues with that than I had before. So I think the very low humidity combined with using an evaporative cooler to cool the house most of the time has just caused some wonkiness with wood core scabbards. Now, I will say that a looser scabbard is better than a tighter one, because if the wood does shrink, a tighter one could get to be too tight, whereas if it gets a little bit looser, it's still usable even if it goes from loose to very loose. So it's not really a problem, I don't think, for this sword, because I don't think you can really account for every single climate, especially at the price point we're talking about. So that's enough about the scabbard. And that should tell you, if that's the only thing that I could think of as an improvement for this sword, then it's pretty obvious I'm going to recommend it. At $500, I think this is an outstanding deal. I honestly think LK Chen is underpricing their work. This is a gorgeous sword that is a lot of fun to use. It's just a great example of a sword type that you don't see a lot of. And again, it's just a blast to use. I really enjoy it. It's a beautiful sword as well. The pattern welding is really nicely done. The cord wrap is very, very well done. I am just blown away by the quality of this sword, and I think LK Chen is absolutely nailing it. So if you're looking to get your hands on a Chinese longsword, this is it. And that's going to wrap up this review. I want to say thank you to KK from LK Chen for reaching out to me and offering to loan the sword for review. I really appreciate it, and I've really enjoyed my time. Thank you, KK. For everybody else, I have a number of other LK Chen swords on loan to me that I'm going to be doing videos in the coming months. They're not going to be full reviews. They're going to be a bit shorter and a bit more informal. And I'm trying to find time in between doing my normal reviews to get those put together. Keep an eye out for them. And if you liked this review, please do all the normal YouTube things like subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave a comment, all the things that encourage YouTube to spread the video more and help the channel continue to grow. Until next time, Alien 2 out.